Hello everybody. In this video we're going to be looking at the book of Hebrews and in particular the high priesthood of Jesus. We're going to be looking at the Day of Atonement and the mapping of the typological high priest activity on the Day of Atonement onto Jesus as it appears in the book of Hebrews. Now I've been wanting to make this video for quite a while now. Before I put the video out, I wanted to just go back and look through the book of Hebrews and refamiliarize myself with the topic. And what I realized is that I was actually misinterpreting some things, particularly in chapter 9. I had always taken the view, for 30 years or so, that the first tabernacle in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 8 was the earthly sanctuary. It was Herod's temple. It was the whole thing. It was the whole structure of the old covenant temple. And when the author of Hebrews says that the way into the holy place has not been made manifest while the first tabernacle is still standing, I took that to mean standing and erect. Kind of like Matthew 24, not one stone here will be left upon another that will not be torn down. So as far as the first tabernacle, that is the physical building itself, still stood, the way into the holy place was just off limits for Christians. And now overall, while that is not correct, at least in terms of what the first tabernacle is that the author of Hebrews is referring to, the author of Hebrews actually does get around to saying that. But what I was missing by not seeing the first tabernacle as the inner compartment is that there's quite a bit going on in the book of Hebrews that I was missing. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. I also want to point out that at the end of this video, I'm going to be dealing with some objections to the views that I put forward in this video. I'm not dealing with any objections that are outside of the book of Hebrews. So there's going to be a lot of pushback to the ideas that I'm presenting in this video that I'm not going to cover. But what I am going to do is I'm going to add an article or a book. I'm not sure what it is, but there's a PDF written by E.W Bullingers on the rich man and Lazarus. And E.W Bullingers is a dispensationalist. So he's a dispensationalist and he's a futurist. So he deals with all the objections that most people would have to the argument that I'm going to present in this video. What's interesting is obviously E.W Bullingers is a futurist and a dispensationalist, whereas I'm a preterist. So how could we have the same view? Well, he's one of those interesting people who is considered a hyper-dispensationalist. There you go. A hyper-dispensationalist has the same view as a hyper-preterist. Not the same view, but you'll understand what I mean as you watch the video. But yeah, he deals with everything. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. There's also a video that I've watched that specifically kind of goes through E.W Bullingers' paper on the rich man and Lazarus, but I cannot remember the guy's name, and I haven't seen any of his videos in a long time. So hopefully, if it comes up and I can remember it, or if it pops up on my YouTube, I will add that also to the link in the description. So let's go ahead and get into it, and we'll look at the book of Hebrews. Okay, so what I want to do first is just familiarize ourselves with the language that the author uses relative to Jesus as the great high priest and relative to the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement in the letter of Hebrews. So for time's sake, what I'm going to do is just read the highlighted portions of the verses that we produced on the screen here. And I'm going to give some commentary. So beginning in Hebrews 3:1, the author says, "Consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession." Hebrews 4:14 through 16, "Having a great high priest, having passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, we should hold firmly to our confession." Now in the above passages, Jesus the Son of God is positively identified as the great high priest. Christ having become a high priest. You are a priest forever. Being a son, he learned obedience. He became the author of eternal salvation to all those obeying him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now first, Jesus was appointed high priest by God himself, in the same manner as Aaron was. Second, the author is not content with the mere designation priest in Psalms 110:4. Adding the modifier high. This is of paramount importance in terms of the overall direction that the author is about to lead the reader. with reference to the high priest and his function in or on the Day of Atonement. Only the high priest performed duties on the Day of Atonement, not just any priest. Entering into that within the veil, where Jesus, the forerunner for us, has entered, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now here the author gives the reader the first glimpse of the movement of the high priest on the Day of Atonement being mapped onto Jesus, the great high priest, entering that within the veil, which the high priest did once every year on the Day of Atonement. For of the priesthood being changed, of necessity a change of law also is taking place. Jesus has been constituted a high priest, not according to the law of the fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an indestructible life. You are a priest forever. There is a putting away of the preceding commandment, and the introduction of a better hope, by which we draw near to God. Jesus, such a high priest, having been exalted higher than the heavens, did this once for all, having offered up himself. The word of oath, which is after the law, appoints a son, having been perfected forever. Now in the group of passages above, the author shifts to a discussion of the implication of Jesus becoming a high priest. For the priesthood being changed, of necessity, a change of law is also taking place. What was instituted at Sinai, the law or the Old Covenant, and ministered by the Levitical priesthood was being changed. The introduction of the New Covenant was not to be a second or latter phase existing alongside the Old in the age to come. On the contrary, the introduction of the New signaled that the time for the putting away of the Old had arrived. There is a change between the Old to the New, and the author is using two present tense verbs. The priesthood is being changed, and a change of law that is taking place. The author is not looking backwards to an alleged instantaneous change that had occurred in the past, at the cross, but rather an ongoing change that was happening in the present. Also, this is the first occasion that the author introduces the reader to Jesus having offered up himself, furthering the imagery of Jesus as high priest, offering himself in his priestly capacity to make atonement. Jesus is both high priest and sacrifice. We have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the holy places and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord has pitched, not man. For certainly, if he were on earth, he would not even be a priest at all, there being those offering the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly. The tabernacle, that is the earthly tabernacle, is the pattern having been shown to you on the mountain. Those are words that Yahweh spoke to Moses. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted upon better promises. The author then quotes Jeremiah, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, and I will ratify a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day of my having taken hold of their hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt." Now in saying new, he has made obsolete the first. That which is growing old and aging is near vanishing. Now in this group of passages, basically the entirety of chapter 8, the author begins by saying that everything he has said up until this point is summarized in what follows. Jesus is a high priest in heaven, not on earth. If he were on earth, then Jesus would not be a priest at all. Rather, he is in heaven, ministering in the holy places in the true tabernacle that the Lord pitched, not man. This is also where the author first introduces to the reader the idea of holy places in terms of the ministry of Jesus. By way of contrast, the Levitical priesthood operated on earth in an earthly sanctuary, which is typological of the true sanctuary in heaven. Here he introduces the reader to the idea that the Old Covenant temple is a type and shadow of the heavenly one, being patterned after the true tabernacle. He then returns to the change of priesthood, change of covenants language that he introduced previously, indicating that the first covenant was decreed obsolete by God when Jeremiah prophesied that there would be a new covenant. What God instituted at Sinai, the covenant, the priesthood, and its sanctuary, the entire complex of the Old Testament system, was near vanishing as the author penned this letter. The causal factor for its near vanishing is the better covenant, having been enacted on better promises. The end of the Old Covenant was not something the author had collapsed into the historical events of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, the Christ event. It is a near future event. The priest enters into the first tabernacle regularly, but only the high priest enters the second, once in the year, not without blood. Here the author is drawing the reader's attention to the Day of Atonement, as it stands distinct from the daily sacrifice that occurred regularly and took place in the first or outer tabernacle. The way into the holy places has not yet been made manifest, the first tabernacle still having standing, which is a symbol for the present time, in which both gifts and sacrifices are being offered, until the time of Reformation. Now, in these verses, the author is telling the reader that the temple system, being set up the way that it was according to the instructions given to Moses, signifies something specific, something that is parabolic or symbolic, which means that the earthly tabernacle with its two components pointed to something in addition to, and much more than, what appeared on the surface, in the sense of it being a compartmentalized structure separated by a veil. The two compartments in their respective services signified that the way into the holy places is not yet revealed while the first tabernacle has standing, which is a parable for the present time. Much more is to be said about this section later, but in the sections that follow, the bulk of chapter 9, the author is explicitly tying together Jesus, the high priest, entering the heavenly holy places, having passed through the veil to fulfill the atonement that was typified in the Old Covenant system, its priesthood, and the typological temple on the Day of Atonement. What follows in chapter 9 is the crescendo of all that has been said in his letter up until chapter 9. Christ, having appeared as high priest, entered to the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not of this creation. Through his own blood he entered once for all into the holy places. Christ offered himself unblemished. Christ has entered not into holy places made by hands, copies of the true ones, but into heaven itself, now to appear for us in the presence of God. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. Now Jesus appeared as high priest, offering himself, passing through the veil, entering the greater, more perfect tabernacle, the heavenly holy places, not the copies of the true, but rather heaven itself, to fulfill what was typified by the Levitical priest on the Day of Atonement. Furthermore, the once per year language in the Old Covenant services is being mapped onto Jesus typologically as a once for all time event, in that it is never repeated again. This is evident in the language that follows. But now he has been revealed once in the consummation of the ages for the putting away of sin by the sacrifice of himself. Christ, having been offered once in order to bear the sins of many, will appear for a second time, apart from sin, to those eagerly awaiting him for salvation. Now the first appearing or revealing is associated with the cross event, the putting away of sin by the sacrifice of himself. This fulfills what was typified by the Levitical high priest who sacrificed the spotless lamb on the Day of Atonement. The author has already traced the movement of the Levitical high priest, mapping that movement onto Jesus, beginning with the sacrifice outside the temple complex. The priest then moves through the first tabernacle, approaching the veil, passing through the veil, thus entering the most holy place, the second compartment. All of this typological movement has been mapped onto Jesus, the great high priest, up until this point. However, there is a final act or movement of the high priest involved in the Day of Atonement, and that is the second appearing. The author holds this out in the future tense. Appear is future indicative. Will appear. Jesus will appear to those awaiting him eagerly. Awaiting is a present participle. The author is drawing from the imagery of the congregation gathered around the entrance to the outer court, awaiting the Levitical high priest to return from within the most holy place after making the atonement, signaling that the atonement was complete. That was the second appearing of the Levitical high priest on the typological or Old Covenant Day of Atonement. In the typological Old Covenant system, on the Day of Atonement, there shall be no man in the tabernacle of meeting when he goes in to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out, that he may make atonement for himself, for his household, and for all the assembly of Israel. Entrance into the typological temple complex as a whole was not allowed until the atonement was complete, which is when He, the high priest, comes out. The final act or movement of the priest is therefore held out by the author as future and absolutely necessary. The final act of the Day of Atonement is necessary in order for those eagerly awaiting Jesus' second appearing to enter the holy places that Jesus had entered as a forerunner for us, that is, heaven itself. Now, up until this point of the video, we have been tracing with broad strokes the author's introduction of the key points or concepts with which he has been primarily occupied. Now, first, Jesus, the Son of God, is the high priest alluded to in Psalms 110:4. The author spends a good amount of time and space in his letter establishing this, often repeating himself and quoting the same psalm. Second, the implications of Jesus, the Son of God, as high priest has enormous ramifications for the Old Covenant as an entire system, temple, and priesthood. It is being changed. It is obsolete, growing old, and it is, at the time of the composition and publishing of the Hebrew letter, near vanishing. Third, the author is progressively and incrementally mapping the ritual and movement of the Levitical high priest on the Day of Atonement onto Jesus, the great high priest. Fourth, the author brings everything to a crescendo in chapter 9, particularly at the end where he unquestionably holds out a future expectation of the final movement typified by the Levitical high priest on the Day of Atonement, that is, the second appearing of Jesus. Fifth, embedded in the letter is the hope set before us, entering within the veil where Jesus has entered as a forerunner. There is the obscure, yet significant section about the Holy Spirit, signifying that the way into the holy places has not yet been revealed while the first tabernacle has standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Now, entering where Jesus has entered, beyond the veil, that is, entering heaven itself, is a future hope tied to the standing of the first tabernacle in the present time. Entering where Jesus has entered is also tied to Jesus appearing a second time, thus completing the Day of Atonement typified in the Old Covenant system. There shall be no man in the tabernacle until he comes out. So let's turn our attention now to the obscure but significant section of Hebrews 9:8-9. Now, beginning in Hebrews 9, verse 1, the author writes, "Therefore also indeed, the first had regulations of worship and an earthly sanctuary." Now, by the first, he means the first covenant. We know this is the case because in the immediately preceding verse, the author says, when he says new, referring to the new covenant mentioned in the quotation from Jeremiah he had just quoted, he has made the first obsolete. The first being the first covenant as opposed to the new covenant. Therefore, the first covenant had regulations of worship and an earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first in which were both the lampstand and the table, and the bread of presentation, which is called the holy place. So he's clearly referring to the first compartment as a tabernacle, the first tabernacle, called the holy place. Now behind the second veil was a tabernacle being called the Holy of Holies. Therefore, he's clearly calling the second compartment, the compartment beyond the veil, a tabernacle called the Holy of Holies. He then goes on to describe the furniture in the second compartment. So in verses 1 through 5, the author is basically calling attention to the first and the second tabernacles, the holy place and the most holy place, and describing the way that they were furnished. In verse 6, he says, "Now these things having been prepared thus." Now prepared is the same word up here. For a tabernacle has been prepared. So these things is a demonstrative pronoun talking about the two tabernacles and their preparation, their separation and their furnishing. He goes on to say, indeed, the priests enter into the first tabernacle, regularly accomplishing the sacred services. This is the daily sacrifice, as opposed to the Day of Atonement, when only the high priest enters into the second tabernacle once in the year, not without blood, which he offers for himself and the sins of ignorance of the people. So basically what the author is doing here is he's detailing out the earthly sanctuary, the two tabernacles, and their furnishings, and then detailing out the regulations of worship, which is the priests entering into the first tabernacle regularly, performing the daily sacrifices and the daily cleansings, and the Day of Atonement, when the high priest enters into the second once per year, and how the two tabernacles and the priestly service relate to the Old Covenant. Now in verses 8 through 10, what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit closer by looking at the Greek to see exactly what's going on here. Now the author begins with another demonstrative pronoun. The demonstrative pronouns points back to the priests entering the first tabernacle, performing the daily ritual, and the high priest entering into the second only once per year. Now by this was signifying the Spirit. The word here is delantos, which means to show, make clear, reveal, from delos, to make plain. Now notice that delantos is a present participle. Therefore it should be translated is signifying. For the translation was signifying, we would expect to see an aorist tense or a past tense. But instead this is a present participle. Therefore, by this is making plain the Holy Spirit that not yet, and this is mepo, it's just basically exactly the way it appears on the screen, not yet has been made manifest, okay? Now this is perfect tense that basically means to make clear, visible, or manifest, to know, from phaneros, to render apparent. Now many translations render this reveal. Now the Holy Spirit is indicating by the two tabernacle system that not has been revealed the into holy places. Holy places here is the heavenly sanctuary that Jesus entered. Holy places is neuter plural. The first tabernacle is feminine singular. The second tabernacle, it is feminine singular. The holy places being neuter and plural indicates the heavenly sanctuary. And we know this is the case because a few verses later, the author says, Jesus did not enter holy places made by hands. Holy places in that verse is also neuter plural. Now we know he's not talking about the earthly sanctuary because he just finished saying that priests continually enter the holy places in the first tabernacle performing divine service, and the high priest enters only once a year. So we know he's talking about the heavenly sanctuary where Christ entered as a forerunner for us. So not yet has been made manifest the holy places way. The word here is hadan. It is a way, road, journey, path, apparently a primary road, a road, by implication, a progress, figuratively, a mode or means. Now the word hadan comes at the end of the sentence, but in English we would put this at the beginning of the sentence. The Holy Spirit is indicated that the way into the holy places not yet has been manifest. Now in the Bible Hub lexical summary, they say road, way, journey, or path. So what we see in the last definition is the idea of entering. Now, while the Bible Hub lexical summary does not give a whole lot of information on Hadan in terms of a way or path versus entrance, there are several other lexical sources that do. Now, this is William Mounts. He defines Hadas as number one, a way or a road, and number two, a means of access, approach, or entrance. And he specifically cites Hebrews 9:8. It is entrance. It is means of access, okay? The way into the holy place isn't just the road that gets you there. It is the entrance or means of access. Now, also, when we look at the NIV Theological Dictionary of New Testament Words, we see that in connection with the conception of Jesus' high priesthood, Hebrews 9:8 and 10:19 through 20 speak of the way or entrance into the sanctuary, whereby hadas almost acquires the sense of isodos, which is access. So the NIV says hadas, while clearly meaning entrance, doesn't quite rise to the level of access in terms of the semantic range of hadas. They say it almost acquires the sense of access. Now, in addition to this, we have a critical lexicon and concordance to the English-Greek New Testament from Bullinger, which also has access in agreement with Mounts as being within the semantic range of hadas, attributing access directly to Hebrews 9:8 and 10:20. In my opinion, there is strong lexical support that has hadas as entrance and access, the access point and entrance. Now, the way or entrance into the holy places is a direct object of what not yet has been made manifest. Entrance into the holy places where Jesus entered has not yet been made manifest, and the author continues, still the first tabernacle having standing. Now the adverb at, which is translated still, is basically an adverb that points to time. It is of time. Strong's lists still, yet, and even now. Still is not a bad translation as it connotates a past condition that continues until the present. Even now is perhaps a more preferred translation, given that the present participle of having is connected with standing. Okay, the first tabernacle having standing. This is present participle. Still connotates a past action continuing in the present. Like, are you still working at such and such place? Are you still smoking cigarettes? If we ask the author of Hebrews, does the first tabernacle still have a standing? His answer is yes, because in the very next verse he begins saying, which is a symbol for the present time. So in my opinion, even now is perhaps a more preferred translation. Even now, the first tabernacle having standing. Now, when we look at standing, it basically has two meanings. It is rebellion, insurrection, and dissension, or it is standing in the sense of exist, okay? Now, according to Strong's, it is an insurrection or an uproar from the base of histemi. Standing, properly the act, i.e. by analogy, position or existence, okay? That's the meaning that we're looking at here, is having position and having existence. As Thayer's has it, in Hebrews 9:8, the standing is the station or state, to stand or exist, to have stability. So fundamentally, having standing means to exist and have position. Now, by the first tabernacle, the author still means the first compartment. He does not mean the entirety of the sanctuary. Now, what I would like you to notice, so that we don't have to come back to this page, is that the first tabernacle having standing is a phrase that is all in the feminine singular. Okay? The first tabernacle having standing is feminine singular. Now, in the next verse, the author begins with a relative pronoun. Now, that relative pronoun is feminine singular, which is. The relative pronoun has a direct referent or antecedent, and that antecedent is feminine singular. Which is a symbol refers back to the first tabernacle, and specifically the first tabernacle having standing. The word translated symbol is from parabolo. Parabolo means parable, comparison, illustration, or allegory. So the author is saying that the first tabernacle is a parable or an allegory. The author continues saying this is a parable for the time present. Now, by the phrase for the time present, the author can mean nothing less than the present time, the time in which he was penning this letter, the time in which he was composing his words, which is 30 plus years after the cross. Okay, this is very important. 30 plus years after the cross, the author is saying that the access, the entrance into the most holy places where Jesus has entered, is not yet made manifest. It is not yet revealed. Okay? And he specifically says that the first tabernacle is a parable for the present time. Both gifts and sacrifices are being offered. Okay? This is present indicative. Being offered is present indicative. They are not being able. They are presently not being able in regard to conscience to make perfect the one worshiping. This is present participle. For they consist only in foods and drinks and various washings, ordinances of the flesh, being imposed until the time of reformation. Now again, being imposed is present participle. The regulations of the flesh, which is the same word used in verse 1, regulations of worship, here he's calling them regulations of the flesh, they were still being imposed. Worship was still going on at the temple in the first tabernacle. They were still performing the daily sacrifices, and they were still performing the once per year entrance into the holy place on the Day of Atonement. Now, having looked closely at the Greek and taking into account the overwhelming occurrence and usage of present tense verbs in this section, including the author's direct statement that the continued standing or existence of the first tabernacle even now is a parable for the time present, and that is 30 plus years after the cross, the overwhelming support from the syntax and the grammar is that entrance into the holy places that Jesus had entered as a forerunner for us has not yet been revealed, as the author wrote this letter. The first tabernacle obstructed entrance into heaven so long as it continued to have standing. That is what the grammar and syntax of these verses plainly declare. Please note also that I am not saying Christians do not have access and the ability to enter heaven today. I'm simply pointing out that there was no entrance for the first century Christians yet, as the author wrote his letter. either early or late 60s. Entrance into heaven depended upon and is contingent upon two things: the negation of the first tabernacle having standing, and the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement, the second appearing of Jesus from within the holy places. I do affirm that the second appearing of Jesus from within the heavenly holy places, in fulfillment of the typological Day of Atonement, occurred in 70 AD, in direct connection with the fall of the earthly sanctuary at the close of the Old Covenant age. Matthew 24. Let's turn our attention to the phrase, which is a parable for the present time. The direct object of the relative pronoun is the first tabernacle having standing. So the question is, what is the first tabernacle a parable of? And the answer is not directly provided. It's like Jesus' parable of the fig tree in Matthew 24. Jesus does not explain the parable, unlike Paul in Galatians 4, who tells us what the allegory of Sarah and Hagar is. These women are two covenants, both representing two seed types, two Jerusalems, and two states of existence: flesh versus spirit and slave versus free. So what is the first tabernacle a parable of? If we synthesize the argument, the parable points to A, the Old Covenant order as a whole. The first tense stands for the entire system of the Levitical priests performing the regulations of worship, including sacrifices and ritual cleansing, the earthly sanctuary in which those services were performed, and restricted access, and B, the period in which that system still functioned. This is the present time of the author, before the old order is removed. And C, the temporary obstructing nature of the old covenant. The tabernacle's very existence signals not yet. Entrance and access is still closed for all but the high priest who entered to make atonement as a forerunner for us. That is the parable. Now, interestingly, when we look at the commentaries, we notice that many of them support this conclusion. Now, Meyer's New Testament commentary says, the thought is, by the ordering that the most holy place, the presence chamber, and place of manifestation of God might not be entered save on one single day of the year, and by the high priest alone, while the daily Levitical service of the priest is accomplished in the holy place, and thus approach to the former debarred and shut off by the latter. The Holy Ghost proclaims that so long as the Levitical priesthood, and consequently the Mosaic law in general, continues, the immediate access to God is not yet permitted. This is exactly what we have affirmed in our analysis of the passage, that thus in order to the bringing about and rendering possible of a full and direct communion with God, the Old Testament covenant religion must fall, and the more perfect one brought in by Christ must take its place. This is exactly what our analysis of the passage has revealed. With the phrase present time, there is no escaping the grammatical force that by this he means the now time. That is, as he is authoring this book, writing his words. However, the important point that the author is conveying to the reader is how the present time relates to the totality of time that has gone before, leading up to the present time. He is conveying where he and his readers stand in relation to the Old Covenant era of divine priestly service and the temple complex, the worship system instituted at Sinai. For it is that system and its entire time of operation that the author means by the phrase ordinances of the flesh being imposed until the time of Reformation. This is the same word, ordinances, and equivalent phrase that he uses in the first verse of the chapter. Even the first covenant had ordinances of worship. The ordinances of the flesh, or ordinances of worship, were not just being imposed now, in the present time. Rather, they had been imposed since Mount Sinai, and therefore in service for nearly 1,500 years. The author positions himself and his readers at the close of that era, for that which is growing old and fading is near disappearing. For in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. For now, at the close of the ages, he has been revealed to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. The first tabernacle is therefore a parable or allegory of not only the Old Covenant, its priesthood, ordinances of worship, and earthly sanctuary, it is also a parable of the time of its service, the present age of divine ordinances instituted by God at Sinai, whose end had come. The time of Reformation, however, has also been inaugurated, which also informs the reader as to where they stand in relation to the New Covenant era, having been inaugurated at the Christ event in the past. The author connects the inauguration of the New Covenant with when Christ appeared as a high priest and entered through his own blood, passing through the veil into the holy places, the greater and more perfect tabernacle. This event is in the author's past. Therefore, the present time is both the last days of the era that has gone before, culminating in its removal, its change, having become obsolete and near disappearing, while also the inaugural days of the new era, the era of the new covenant. The present time is therefore the time during which the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant was taking place. The priesthood being changed, there is of necessity a change of law also taking place. The change was not instantaneous and in the past, rather it was ongoing in the present time, and thus the reason the author is using present tense verbs. The present time, these last days, the consummation of the ages, the time of Reformation, all of these refer to the same time, and that is the time frame during which the transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant was taking place. Now, what I see going on in the text is a three-pronged theme. First, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence and support from the text, as well as scholarship, that the first tabernacle represents the entire Old Covenant system and the time of its operation even up to the present time, parabolically or allegorically, that is, the priesthood, the covenant, the temple, and the worship. And it is the continued standing of the Old Covenant, represented in the text as the first tabernacle, that stands in the way of entering the heavenly sanctuary in the time that is now present, that is, for all but Christ the forerunner, who has passed through the heavens, penetrating the veil, his flesh, and sitting at the right hand of God in the heavens, ministering the holy places, the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. This identification of the first tabernacle with the entire Old Covenant system itself is the first thematic prong. Second, we must ask the question as to where Jesus is positionally and spatially just prior to entering within the veil. For the typological Levitical high priest, he was in the first tabernacle. The veil separated the first tabernacle from the second tabernacle. Therefore, it makes sense that Jesus is also in the first tabernacle, which is also the Old Covenant system, as this is how the first tabernacle is expressed and presented parabolically by the author. Jesus' movement is from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. The veil is Jesus' flesh, his death, inaugurating the New Covenant. Hebrews is mapping the movement of the Levitical high priest in the Day of Atonement onto Christ and his movement through the first tabernacle, the Old Covenant, passing through the veil, his flesh, and into the true tabernacle, the holy places not made with hands, heaven itself. This is the second thematic prong. And third, if we take a top-down approach directly from the text itself, we see that in Hebrews 8:1, in the heavenly realm, the heavens are equivalent with the holy places, which are equivalent with the true tabernacle. All three terms are synonymous. We have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the holy places, and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord has pitched, not man. Below is the earthly type and pattern of the heavenly, the heavens being the equivalent to the holy places, which are equivalent to the typological tabernacle. Remember, the earthly tabernacle is a shadow, type, and pattern of the true tabernacle. Heavens and holy places are both plural and synonymous. The earthly tabernacle had its plural holy places, the two compartments, first and second tabernacles. These two compartments are referred to as the heavens. Now the text states that Jesus passed through the heavens, being thus exalted above the heavens. And the author specifically says that Jesus' exaltation is in the heavens. There are therefore two sets of heavens that the author is referring to. One set of heavens that Jesus passed through and was exalted above, and another set of heavens that he is exalted in. The first set of heavens corresponds to the entire Old Covenant system, represented parabolically by the first tabernacle, which is also the tabernacle that the high priest had to pass through to approach the veil on the Day of Atonement. The earthly sanctuary, that is, the whole edifice itself, had its holy places, which are the two tabernacles. However, the two tabernacles, The holy places that make up the earthly tabernacle are also the heavens, having been patterned after the true tabernacle, which also has holy places and heavens. The holy places, earthly and typological, are equated by the author with the heavens that Jesus passed through and was exalted above. The second set of heavens corresponds to the true tabernacle, the heavens or the holy places that Jesus entered, not the heavens that Jesus passed through. These are the heavens or holy places where Jesus is a minister and high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, a minister of the new covenant. Now, having said all that, when we trace the entire movement of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, the Levitical typological high priest began by entering from the outer court into the first tabernacle, and then entered through the veil into the second tabernacle. The final movement of the Levitical high priest was to return from within the second tabernacle, moving back through the first tabernacle, and then exiting the first tabernacle through the first veil, and thus appearing a second time to those who eagerly awaited the high priest. Now, this final movement signaled that the atonement was complete, and the priests were allowed to enter the sanctuary. As it is stated in Leviticus 16:17, there shall be no man in the tabernacle of meeting when he goes in to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out. Now, concerning the high priest Jesus and his second appearing from beyond the veil and from within the second tabernacle, that is, the true tabernacle, heaven itself, when he appears a second time, he does not pass back through the first tabernacle. It has vanished. It no longer exists. The way into the most holy places, that is, the holy places that are synonymous with the heavens that Christ entered as a forerunner, is now revealed. The first tabernacle no longer stands in the way. It no longer obscures entrance. The first tabernacle no longer has standing. That which was growing old and becoming obsolete, that is, the first covenant, which is what the first tabernacle symbolized parabolically, had now vanished. And this is exactly what Hebrews says in 12 verse 26 through 27. At that time his voice shook the earth. Here the author is talking about the giving of the law at Sinai and the inauguration of the first covenant. He continues, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens as well. The words yet once more signify the removal of what can be shaken, that is, of things made, so that the unshakable may remain. Now the heavens that were shaken and removed corresponds with the typological earthly temple and priesthood of the Old Covenant. The heavens that Jesus passed through and was exalted above are removed. What remains is the heavenly sanctuary, the Melchizedek priesthood, and the new covenant, the kingdom that the first century Christians were receiving and that could not be shaken. Now finally, in terms of Hebrews mapping the movement of the Levitical high priest onto Christ and his movement through the holy places and the heavens, the author only maps the movement of the high priest onto Christ insofar as his movement into the heavenly sanctuary. The third or final movement, the return of the Levitical high priest from within the Holy of Holies, is not mapped onto Christ. The author does not have Christ returning from within the heavens, the holy places, or the true tabernacle. The author never mentions a return of Christ from within or from beyond the veil. I found this rather striking, as the more I looked for any language that has Jesus returning to where the movement began, the more I realized that it is not there. Rather, the author has those having gathered around the throne of grace, that is, those having drawn near and eagerly awaiting the second appearing, as entering into the heavenly Holy of Holies, where Jesus the forerunner for us has entered. That is the way the author has Jesus appearing a second time to those who eagerly await him. The appearing is not by the high priest returning to the people, passing back through the first tabernacle, which has disappeared, to where they had drawn near and gathered, waiting in anticipation, where the movement began, but rather the people are entering into where he is. This is the hope being set before us, which we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and entering into that within the veil, where Jesus the forerunner for us has entered. The first tabernacle that obscured and prevented entrance into the holy places, having been removed, now the way into the holy places is revealed. Now at this point I want to address a seeming contradiction between two things that are both true at the same time: the coming language in the book of Hebrews and the permanence of Jesus in heaven. In other words, in my opinion, the language of Hebrews has Jesus entering the true tabernacle, heaven itself, once, never to be repeated, and a permanent priesthood in that tabernacle. Yet the author also has Jesus coming in the future tense, which seems to contradict his language concerning Jesus' priesthood, eternal in the heavens, as I have pointed out in the sections above. So let's look at Hebrews 10, verse 37 through 39. In a very little while, the one coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. And if he might shrink back, my soul does not take pleasure in him. But we are not of those drawing back to destruction, but of faith to the preserving of the soul. First, let's briefly look at the context of this verse and what is going on in chapter 10. For if we sin willingly after we are to receive the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and fury of fire being about to devour the adversaries. Anyone having set aside the law of Moses dies without mercies on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more punishment do you think he will deserve, the one having trampled underfoot the Son of God, and having esteemed ordinary the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and having insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know the one having said, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, and again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now, real quick, without getting too sidetracked, I just want to point out that the author in the section that we just quoted is quoting directly from Deuteronomy 32. Okay, vengeance is mine, I will repay, again, directly from Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32 is specifically about the end of Israel according to the flesh in the last days, at the time of their end. Therefore, the author is correlating the coming in a little while language with the end of Israel according to the flesh in Deuteronomy 32. Now, the author of Hebrews is developing 2 distinct theological strains. One is that of the high priest and one is that of the judge. Vengeance, wrath, and judgment is not a function of the Levitical high priest on the Day of Atonement. The coming and will come language is undoubtedly the ubiquitous coming of Christ language that we see elsewhere in the Scripture, the second coming, the second advent. But in this high priest strain, or aspect of what the Hebrew author is presenting theologically regarding Christ, judgment is not any function ever prescribed to the Levitical high priest on the Day of Atonement. Rather, this is a God action. I'm not disputing that the Day of Atonement was also a day of judgment. However, it is a day of judgment and wrath averted for those whom the high priest made the atonement. That is the theological strain that the author is following. Eschatologically, there is an aspect of judgment that is tied to the same Day of Atonement for those whom rejected Christ, having trampled upon the Son of God, and having esteemed ordinary the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and having insulted the Spirit of grace. That judgment was fast approaching, as the opposite side of the same coin, those whom there remains a sacrifice, and those whom there no longer remains a sacrifice. The first group, entrance into the holy places. The second group, judgment and punishment and vengeance. The complete dissolution of the typological system that they clung to, having rejected the new. However, there is not any aspect or function typified by the Levitical priesthood being mapped onto Christ with regard to the coming of Christ in judgment, wrath, and vengeance. That was simply not a function of the Levitical priesthood. Rather, the theological strain or aspect that is drawn from the Levitical priesthood and being mapped onto Christ is solely on the side of atonement, and judgment averted for those atoned for, and the movement of the Levitical high priest into the Holy of Holies. The coming side is solely on the theological side of wrath and vengeance, having to do with the removal of the very thing that is preventing those who had gathered and drawn near from entering the true Holy of Holies, where Jesus entered. The entire complex of the Old Covenant system, its priesthood, and its typological temple. The bulk of the book itself spends the majority of time and space developing Jesus as high priest imagery, not Jesus as judge imagery. It's there, it exists, but it's not highly developed. Note also that I do not see the second appearing and the second coming language, which are, in my opinion, 2 distinct theological strains, as being separate and distinct in terms of their time of occurring. Both theological ideas occur on the same day that was drawing near. They are one and the same in that regard. Therefore, in my opinion, the coming language is not to be mapped onto the priestly theological strain, nor vice versa. The coming language is not therefore leaving the heavenly Holy of Holies and returning back to where the priestly movement began on the earth. the Old Covenant. The author never has Jesus, the great high priest, as leaving or coming out of the heavens or the true tabernacle anywhere. In fact, he says the opposite. First, in 9:12, through his own blood he entered once for all into the holy places, having obtained eternal redemption. The Greek word is ephipax. It means a one-time event, not to be repeated. The author of Hebrews is not envisioning a repeated action. He does not envision Jesus, the great high priest, as having entered the holy places and then returning to the earth, the old covenant, etc., where the movement began, and then entering the holy places again, which is what you find in the modern futuristic eschatological nonsense we often encounter today. Second, he writes, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. And he further affirms on several occasions that Jesus is a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. His priesthood is permanent and abiding forever, as he is always living to intercede for them. And that ministry of interceding is in the heavens, as a minister in the holy places, the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. Therefore, the coming and coming again language is not Jesus leaving the heavenly holy of holies. There isn't any language in the book of Hebrews depicting Christ leaving the heavenly holy of holies, returning to earth, reigning in Jerusalem, or any of that nonsense. Jesus' entrance into the holy places was a one-time event not to be repeated. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. And he is a priest forever. Where is he a priest? In the heavens, in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. These are two theological strains, the high priest strain, which is thoroughly developed in the letter, and the judge strain that certainly is there and exists, but is not developed to any high degree in the letter. Now, I will add here that there's an entire slew of coming language in the New Testament applied to Christ, including language like, he will descend with a shout, and the New Jerusalem coming down out of heavens. It is not the purview of this video to harmonize the permanence of Jesus in the heavens in the Hebrew letter with the coming and descending language found all throughout the New Testament. But I am not dismissing the seeming contradiction, as I believe that it is a worthy area of further study and deserves to be addressed. Before I close this video, I want to look at two of the most common objections to what I have presented in this video. Two of the most common objections are, one, that the old covenant passed away at the cross, and two, that entering heaven at death has been a reality since the cross. Now, concerning both objections, I'm not going to go outside the book of Hebrews, nor consider any objection being raised on the basis of what is written in any other New Testament books. That is not the purview of this video. My sole intention is to remain within the book of Hebrews itself and address any challenges or tests presented from within the confines of the book itself. Now, concerning the first objection. First, the author clearly and unambiguously states that the first covenant was becoming old and aging, both of which are in the present tense verb stem. The old covenant was near disappearing as the author was composing his letter, which is a grammatical fact. Now, second, the author said that the priesthood being changed, which is a present participle, ongoing action being performed in the present, indicated that there is of necessity a change of law that is also taking place, again present indicative, which is ongoing action in the present stem. Third, the Day of Atonement is a constituent element of the Old Covenant. Therefore, if the Old Covenant passed away at the cross, then the Day of Atonement was also fulfilled at the cross. However, the author uses the future indicative verb will appear when referring to Jesus' second appearing from within the veil. If one were to hold to a future second appearing today, then it is apparent that it is not possible for that to be the case without dragging the baggage of the Old Covenant into the future as well. You can't have it both ways. If the ritual is still in progress, then the system that ritual belongs to is still in force. And Hebrews is built on that very assumption. It treats the Old Covenant as a single unified system. It rises together, it falls together. There is no version of Hebrews where the Day of Atonement is still waiting for its final act, but the Old Covenant has already been dismantled. That would be like saying the priest has reappeared before he ever entered the sanctuary. In the same vein, the same principle applies to the passages from Deuteronomy 32 that the author correlates with the coming of Christ, for there is a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and fury of fire being about to devour the adversaries. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. Okay? The fury of fire being about to devour the adversaries, vengeance is mine, I will repay, and the Lord will judge his people, are all passages quoted directly from Deuteronomy 32 and applied by the author of Hebrews to the impending judgment of Israel at the time of their end in AD 70. Deuteronomy 32 verse 22, "For a fire is kindled in my anger, and it burns to the depths of Sheol. It devours the earth and its increase, and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains." Now, this language is judgment of the dead language, and 2 Peter 3 language, the incineration of the earth and its works. Verse 41, "I will take vengeance on my adversaries. I will repay those who hate me." Verse 43, "For he avenges the blood of his servants. He takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him. Vengeance is mine, and recompense. In due time their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand. Their doom comes swiftly. For the Lord will judge his people." When would all this take place? At the time of Israel's end. The Lord saw this and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and daughters. His sons and daughters is a reference to Israel. Then he said, "I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be. For they are a perverse generation, sons in whom is no faithfulness. For they are a nation," that is Israel, "void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them." Again, Israel. If they were wise, they would understand this. Again, Israel, that they would discern their latter end. This is Israel. You simply cannot have prophecies concerning the end of Israel in Deuteronomy 32 being fulfilled in the future from our perspective today without dragging the baggage of the entire Old Covenant into the future as well. Rather, the text of Hebrews is fulfilled in AD 70, when Israel according to the flesh ended, where her covenant, priesthood, worship, and earthly sanctuary were removed, having vanished. Fourth, the phrase ordinances of the flesh being imposed until the time of Reformation is often taken to mean that the Old Covenant ordinances of worship were discontinued at the inception of the time of Reformation, which is when the New Covenant was inaugurated at the Christ event, the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Now, I don't disagree that the time of Reformation was inaugurated at the Christ event in the past, relative to the time of Hebrews composition. However, I disagree that "until" denotes a complete collapse of the ordinances of worship at the Christ event, for this assertion completely negates the grammar and language not only of 8:13, but also verses 9:8 through 9. Basically everything we have determined through exegesis of the grammar and syntax earlier in the video. Rather, the introduction of the New Covenant at the Christ event inaugurated the New Covenant and the time of Reformation. And during that time, the first century, the time present, the Old Covenant was decreasing and the New Covenant was increasing, just as John the Baptist, the last of the Old Testament prophets, said about himself and Jesus, "I must decrease and he must increase." Now let's consider verse 9:26. "But now," and now here is adverbial, not conjunctive, "but now he has been revealed once in the consummation of the ages, for the putting away of sin by the sacrifice of himself." The sacrifice of himself and first revealing is past. However, that event occurred at the consummation of the ages. The consummation or close of the ages is synonymous and equated with the now time. Now, at the close of the ages. Therefore, the close of the ages began at the Christ event in the past and continued until now, 30 plus years after the Christ event. The sacrifice of himself didn't close or consummate the ages instantaneously at the cross. Rather, the second appearing is also tied to the close of the ages, being a near future event in which the first century saints were eagerly awaiting. Now we can see this in Hebrews 1 verse 2 also. God, in these last days, has spoken to us by his Son. God was speaking through, in, and by his Son during Jesus' earthly ministry. That is, past. However, Jesus was speaking in these last days that were both present, as the author wrote, as well as in the past. Therefore, the last days began in the past and continued until the present. The last days didn't begin and terminate instantaneously when Jesus spoke to us. The author of Hebrews was being written during the closing days, the last days, the closing of the age of the Old Covenant era or age, and the beginning of the New Covenant having been inaugurated at the Christ event. Now on the second objection, I know many would like to bring up about 4 to 5 other passages from the New Testament to bear on this topic. However, we will remain within the confines of this letter. Many would point to Hebrews 10:19 through 25 and say that having confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus indicates present ability to enter. But confidence to enter simply does not mean that they either had entered nor that they presently had the ability to enter. Now let's look at the passage. Therefore, brothers, having confidence for entering the holy places by the blood of Jesus. Confidence to enter? Yes. Does he say they had entered? No. Having confidence for entering the holy places by the blood of Jesus by a new and living way. Now, way here is hodos, which we have already seen, denotes entrance and access. So we can clearly see that entering the holy places through the blood of Jesus is the subject at hand here, without question. He goes on to say we should draw near, not enter, but draw near. Again, this is the imagery of the congregation assembling outside of the outer court awaiting the high priest on the Day of Atonement. What were they waiting for? They were waiting for the high priest to appear a second time. He continues saying we should draw near in full assurance of faith. Faith in what? Faith to enter. He also says we should hold fast to the confession of our hope. What was their hope? To enter within the veil where Jesus had entered. For the one having promised is faithful. The one having promised what? The one having promised to return so that where he was, they could also be. He goes on to say that we should not forsake the assembling together of ourselves. Now, many take this to mean the once per week assembly for worship behind closed doors, particularly during the time of persecution. This runs into a problem when you look at verse 13, 12, and 13, because in that passage he says, let us therefore go outside the camp, for here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city that is to come. So there is a clear exhortation there to get out of Jerusalem, to get out of the city. So it cannot be the case that on one hand, he's exhorting them and encouraging them to continue to assemble behind closed doors for worship, and at the same time telling them to get out of the city, for it's about to be destroyed. The assembling together of ourselves is more than likely a spiritual idea of them holding fast to their hope and the confession of their hope, gathering together spiritually as the people did on the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament. They were gathering around, drawing near, awaiting the second appearing. He goes on to say, encourage one another, and so much more as you see the day drawing near. Now, many who want to hold on to the idea that entering heaven was a present reality from the cross forward and had nothing to do with the second appearing of Jesus, because, let's face it, it's difficult to be a futurist if the author of Hebrews is telling us, no, we weren't able to enter until the second appearing of Jesus. So many who hold to that view also recognize that, yes, there is a future hope here. What they tend to do is they turn this into a hope that they have at the point of death, that when they die, that's when they're going to go into heaven. All it takes is dying. From the time of the thief on the cross, let's say, all the way until the book of Hebrews was being composed, when people died, they went to heaven. Therefore, the future expectation in the book of Hebrews is that of dying. They had confidence to enter when they died. But if you look at the text, he exhorts them to encourage one another as they see the day drawing near. So what is the day drawing near? Is it the day they're going to die, or is it the day of judgment that was coming? Well, let's look at verse 35. Therefore do not throw away your confidence. What confidence? Confidence to enter the holy places. Having confidence for entering the holy places is explicitly the confidence he is discussing. He says, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that, having done the will of God, you may receive what's promised. So when do they receive the promise? For he who promised is faithful, but when do they receive it? Do they receive it at death? Well, according to the Hebrews, he says, for in a very, very little while, the one coming will come and will not delay. This is not death. This is the coming of Christ. Therefore, they were waiting the future coming of Christ in order to receive what is promised. That is their confidence. Don't throw away your confidence. It has great reward. When? When they die? No. When the coming one will come, for his coming will not delay. Now, when we look at Hebrews 16, 18 through 20, again, we see in verse 19, we have strong encouragement, having fled for refuge to take hold of the hope set before us. Now, having fled for refuge here can basically mean two things, or possibly both. It can either mean having fled the old covenant system to take refuge into Christ, or it could mean that they had fled the city of Jerusalem for refuge to avoid the coming calamity. However, he says they had fled for refuge in order to take hold of the hope set before us. Now, what is the hope? The hope is entering into that within the veil where Jesus, the forerunner for us, has entered. This is clearly future hope. Now, the question is the hope set before us, which is clearly future, is that hope dying and then entering the heavenly holy places? Or is it the day drawing near, the coming of Christ? Well, in my opinion, it is clearly the coming of Christ. He says we have this hope as an anchor of the soul, both sure and unshakable. Now that hope enters within the veil where Jesus, the forerunner for us, has entered. Now notice he doesn't say where Jesus and all the other Christians who have died since the cross have entered. No, he says where Jesus alone, the forerunner for us, has entered. In fact, if you look at the end of Hebrews 11, which is the great passage of the Hall of Fame of Faith, all the Old Testament faithful who are also awaiting the promise. The author says, and all these, having been commended through their faith, did not receive the promise. They did not receive the promise when they died. For God, having planned something better for us, so that not apart from us, they should be made perfect. Now, being made perfect is the soteriological perfection that the author of Hebrews, all throughout his letter, attributes to the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement, when the high priest comes out of the sanctuary in the Old Covenant system. Whereas, as we've already seen, the Old Covenant system is removed and the high priest is revealed a second time, and they enter the Holy of Holies at that time. This is the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement. The author is considering a future event, the coming of Christ, the day drawing near, the second appearing of Christ to fulfill the Day of Atonement, and until that event, even they, the Old Testament saints, nor the New Testament saints, would be made perfect soteriologically. As the author says, he will appear a second time for salvation. Now that's pretty much all I got on this video. I wanted to do a little bit more looking into the book of Revelation, and I think I'm going to put out a second or follow-up video that's going to look closely at the tabernacle in the book of Revelation, because really Hebrews and the book of Revelation are the only two books of the entire Bible, in my opinion, that have as a central theme and a central focus soteriological perfection in the tabernacle, particularly the heavenly tabernacle. In Revelation, we have no entrance into the heavenly sanctuary until wrath is poured out. Now, that's a significant statement. Anyway, I may do another video where we focus on that. So if you've followed me this far, I certainly appreciate you watching.